Hello, everyone. We still have a few people logging in. We're going to give them just a minute or two to get settled, and then we'll get underway. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Link Center today for this shared learning group. Today, we are focused on navigating risky behaviors. I'm going to go over just a few housekeeping items while we get started. The session is being recorded, and the recording and the transcripts, along with the slide deck, will all be made available on our website. We welcome you to revisit the content yourself and share it with others. Attendees cannot see the names of other attendees, and all attendees are muted. Please use the chat function in Zoom to communicate with other attendees and the hosts in the webinar. You can use the chat by clicking on chat at the bottom of your screen. Please be aware that your name will appear in the chat if you make a comment, and you can change your display name by clicking those three little dots next to your name and selecting rename. We will have representatives from the Link Center watching the chat and responding throughout the session. If you'd like to submit a question or a comment privately to the host and the panelists, you can do that by clicking on the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We have live captioning and ASL interpreters present today. We will be spotlighting the active speaker and the ASL interpreter throughout the webinar. If you click on View on your Zoom screen, you can change the way you see the panelists. And if you're having any trouble with your view, please let us know in the chat. At this time, I'm going to hand the floor over to Dr. Stacy Nonamaker, who's going to get us started with today's presentation. Stacy?
Thanks so much, Stephanie. Hello, good afternoon, everyone, at least here in Pennsylvania. It is so great to be with you today. I am so very excited to jump into this topic of navigating risky behaviors with our colleagues from the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. But first, just a couple more things to add to what Stephanie's already said. We are so very grateful to be able to host the Link Center shared learning groups with you all on a quarterly basis. This is a grant funded by the Administration for Community Living. And these are our opportunities as the Link Center partners to really reach out to the community and talk to you about some things that we know really impact how we support individuals with co-occurring conditions. If you want to learn more about the Link Center and what we're doing and some news and things that we're offering, please take a moment to either click on the link or use the QR code and jump onto our website. We're putting a lot of time and effort into curating resources for you all as you look to have better tools, information, and resources to support individuals with co-occurring conditions. This website is still relatively new, so it's a work in progress, but we urge you all to check it out and check back often as we continue to add to the website. All right, so to jump into our time together today, as I mentioned, the shared learning groups are quarterly offerings, and we host 4 meetings every quarter. Today's meeting is targeted at direct support professionals. Later on today, we'll also be talking to clinical professionals. And then tomorrow, we'll be talking to individuals with lived experience and families of people with lived experience. We do encourage people, if you're feeling like none of these roles really describe who you are, we don't want to box you in. So we encourage you to just jump on one or all of these shared learning groups, but do want to point out that the information in all 4 presentations is the same. And we do change around the content a little bit, whether it's the discussion questions, but to make it relevant to the role that we've identified for that particular group. So the content that you'll see today is really a collaboration among the Link Center partners, and those are folks with lived experience, researchers, and people who work on policy issues. As Stephanie did say, we are going to record and transcribe today's meeting. And that means that we'll write down all the words that people are saying so that they can be referenced. And all of today's materials will be available on the Link Center's website in the coming weeks. So keep your eye out for that. So again, I said I'm really excited about today's topic and just a little bit about what we're going to talk about and dive into in our time together. First, let's just do some introductions. So feel free to use the chat and type in your name, any group, association, or membership you may have in the chat. You can also let us know where you're joining us from. I'm joining us from Lancaster, Pennsylvania today. So we're going to talk about why we want to talk about this topic of navigating risky behaviors, how that relates to the work of the Link Center. We're going to share with you some resources, some training, some information, and also this isn't just an opportunity for us to share what we've been thinking about or what we've been digging into when it comes to this topic, but we're also going to be asking you, what are the resources, trainings, and information that you know about specific to navigating risky behaviors? So that's that really the shared in the shared learning group. We're really looking for an opportunity to let you know what we're thinking, but also really hear from you all about what you're thinking from your role, from your perspective. And we'll really give some space to that at the end of our time together, doing a group exercise that will really help us understand what are some challenges and solutions to navigating risky behaviors, really thinking about what you hear today. And we're really hoping for your participation and your ideas. Please, if you have questions or comments, you can put that in the chat and we'll be sure to keep our eye on that as well. So just a few things that we want to offer as ground setting for our time together today. And these next few slides were developed by folks who are on our steering committee, and I'll talk about our steering committee in just one second. But we really want to ensure we're all on the same page and that this is really a safe space for us to talk about what can sometimes be complicated, tricky, maybe hard conversations. So this meeting, we'll be talking about people's experience and being supported. Some people may have experienced trauma, and that makes it hard to recover and move forward. We encourage you all to take care of yourself and do what is necessary for your comfort and care while we're together today. We should be gentle with ourselves and each other because this is hard work to do. We celebrate that we are all individuals from different backgrounds. We celebrate that we have shared experiences that we can learn from one another. And we know that we are each unique with our own experiences in the world. And finally, we listen and share with open minds and kindness, and we do not judge or blame others for what they share. So again, we're just really hoping to create a safe space, a space where we feel comfortable sharing with one another our thoughts, our perspectives, our experiences. So thank you to those of you who have been saying hello in the chat. It is so great to see so many people joining us, so many people from different places across the nation. And I'm going to ask you to continue to use the chat now to get us started and to prime our presenters today and think about today's topic. And the question that we're going to pose to you all is, what comes to mind when you hear the words risky behavior? So think about that for a moment and please just pop your thoughts in the chat, even if it's one word. We really would love to hear what you're thinking about, or perhaps even what drove you to joining us today. Sexual promiscuity and elopement. Thank you. Just going to read these as they come in. Drug use, injuries, drinking and drug use, not safe, destructive behaviors to self or others, poor choices, elopement, inappropriate conversations on the phone and in media usage, giving out too much information, elopement, endangering behavior on the internet, open, unfiltered use of the internet without some sort of oversight, not safe relationships online and sexual photos sent online, lack of safety awareness, unhealthy relationship, self-injury, behaviors that promote a negative effect on clients, unsafe driving, self-injurious behavior. Thanks so much to everybody. They continue to come in, and I'm really hearing some themes and some things that we all have been thinking about, the partners at the Link Center, as we think about this topic as well. So I think there's some places that you'll hear some commonalities through the content that will be provided today. And thanks to those of you who chimed in, appreciate that. So as I mentioned, we do have a steering committee for the Link Center, and that's made up of 14 individuals with varied lived experiences across the nation. This group of people, they guide and drive the work of the Link Center, and we as partners work very closely with this group of people. We met in person in September. And one of the topics in our conversations was navigating risky behaviors. And what you're seeing in front of you is a graphic representation of that robust discussion. I was there in person as well, and it was really a conversation that I think was very helpful personally. I know that our colleagues who will be speaking today from ASAN, I think was also really impacted by the words and experiences that were shared that day. And really, you'll hear those words of the steering committee throughout the content today that was really taken into consideration in the development of the content. So we just want to pause and give some thanks to our steering committee, to acknowledge our steering committee's commitment to informing this work in so many different ways, not just in today's shared learning group, but above and beyond. And we certainly have the permission of the folks on our steering committee to use their words throughout today's meeting. Okay, and here's where I have the pleasure of introducing my colleagues and the partners in the work of the Link Center from the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, both Jules Good and Noor Pervez, who will be taking it over from here. So Jules and Noor, I am so honored to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Stacy. It's really nice to be here with you all today. My name is Jules Good. I use they, them pronouns. I'm the programs coordinator at the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. I am a white person with short pink hair, and I'm wearing a gray shirt that has the ASAN logo on it. And just to share a little bit about where I'm coming from with this topic, I am a person who is dual diagnosed with I guess a few developmental disabilities and mental health conditions, and I'm someone who has struggled with quote unquote risky behaviors throughout my life. So just wanted to share that as kind of my positionality as we're talking together today. And I will turn it over to Noor now.
Thank you so much. Hey everyone, I am Noor Pervez. I am also with the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, and I use he or they pronouns. Coming at this from both personal and professional experience in this particular realm. And yeah, let's go ahead and get into it. Next slide, please. Awesome. So one of the things that we are going to run into a lot when talking about research around this subject, and that y'all will probably have come across, is the idea of behaviors. So what do we actually mean when we say behaviors? When our group did research about this, we came across the fact that not everyone means the same thing when they talk about behaviors that need support or intervention. And throughout this presentation, we're going to talk about why this is important and how that can kind of shift or change kind of how much power and control is kind of applied when talking about those different subjects. So speaking very literally, behaviors are things that we do, but behaviors in this context, so air quotes behaviors, usually means something weird or disruptive that a disabled person does. And again, weird and disruptive are relative terms. We'll get into that. Next slide, please. Thanks. So what do we mean? So what do we mean by risky behaviors when we're talking in this context? So the definition we're largely working with here is something that causes harm to ourselves or others. So in this context, you'll hear us use the term substance misuse. We say that because, for example, an adult having an alcoholic beverage isn't actually inherently something to be pathologized, right? Like if you're over 21, it's legal drinking age, having a beer at a bar is not an inherently risky behavior. That's a standard thing that adults do. Substance misuse would be basically when engaging with the substance is happening at such a rate or to such an extent that it puts people at risk of justice system involvement. So, for example, dealing with police, or if dealing with the substance in such a way that it can cause self-harm. And again, relative. When we're talking about harming ourselves or others, we can also be talking about self-soothing in a way that causes harm. So, for example, hair pulling, biting yourself until you bleed. And we're also talking about attempts at self-regulation that result in harm to others around you. For example, yelling or speaking angrily isn't inherently risky if, for example, you're in a rage room and your whole purpose in being there is to like throw plates at walls or what have you. But doing that while also, for example, threatening people in the process can fall more into a risky behavior territory. So following through on that, doing risky behaviors does not make someone a bad person. Most of the time, someone taking on a risky behavior does not mean to cause harm. And while we're talking about this, it's also important to think about the concept of dignity of risk, which is basically the fact that we need to take risks in order to learn and grow. And we'll talk more about this later, but basically to kind of foreground this, when you think about, for example, someone learning to walk for the first time, assuming that that's something that someone is capable of, in order for them to kind of get themselves going and get forward kind of motion, first they're going to have to fall down a couple times, right? And they're going to have to learn from the falling process and learn how to balance themselves, how to hold themselves up against stuff. In order to do those things, first, they have to have had the fall, have tried and failed, right? So dignity of risk is this idea that in order to learn and grow and do new things, you have to put yourself in danger at least a little bit. Next slide. So while we're thinking about this concept, it's also important to note that there are risk factors for quote unquote risky behaviors. So these ideas don't come from nowhere. They tend to show us an unmet need. So going back to the August learning group, if you remember the concept of social determinants of health, this is a very, very similar shape. It's the idea that our environment and our background shapes what we do. So when looking at someone taking a risk or behaving in a way that falls in this category, it's important to think about how our environment, our background, and the things that we run into in our lives can change or shape how or why or in what way we go through with these types of actions. Next slide, please. So one of the risk factors for risky behaviors, and I'm sure everyone saw this coming, but it is important to highlight, trauma. This can be both individual trauma. So for example, like throughout the course of one's life, being harmed in various ways that cause ongoing emotional damage. It can also be structural. So when looking at trauma at a structural level, this can be things like racism, sexism, ableism, and those societal factors and the way society is built can change the types of trauma that people are exposed to. And when I say that, people will usually think quite literally in the sense of, say, someone receiving racial abuse or hate crime, which obviously that does apply. But also, there are things that people might think of a little less serious, not seriously, but rather literally, that do apply here. So, for example, thinking about structural racism, some of the direct experiences people will think about will be hate crime. Some of the less direct things people might think about would be where someone grows up. So, for example, if you are coming up in an area that's subject to a lot of environmental racism, for example, the fact that a lot of lower income people, a lot of people of color will often grow up in areas that are more subject to high amounts of pollution, that can change people's development of disabilities, how early on someone might, for example, get asthma or other chronic illnesses, and then in turn be subject to more experiences with healthcare. And unfortunately, as we know, for folks who have ongoing engagement with the healthcare system who are people of color, a lot more racism, a lot more systemic abuse, and a lot more mistreatment that can then in turn lead to ongoing trauma, ongoing emotional regulation issues in some cases, because repeat exposure to medical trauma can cause PTSD. So that in turn kind of gets that chain of events going, and you can start to see how these layers kind of add up and can help you understand how people might default to certain coping mechanisms to try and deal with the results of these both individual level but also structural level traumas. So when thinking about this, we recommend thinking also in terms of the 6 principles of trauma-informed care, which are safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and cultural and historical and gender issues. And all of those things kind of link together as a way to think about how we are providing care and how we can make sure that that is trauma informed and is going to resonate with people in a way that doesn't invalidate or try to kind of ignore these structural and individual factors. Next slide, please. So some other risk factors for risky behaviors that often can kind of get overlooked just a little bit. Lack of communication supports. So what do we mean by communication supports here? So this can be access to an AAC device, AAC being augmented and alternative communication. This can mean access to language, particularly for folks who might, for example, be hard of hearing or deaf and might not have been provided equal access to sign language or tools to learn sign language. This can look like folks who might not speak English as a first language, not being provided communication supports either in their language or the ability to kind of engage with learning a new language if that's something that they would rather choose. So having a lack of communication supports and not offering accessible communications or forms of it can be incredibly frustrating and can make it even more difficult to try to engage with systems and people, and as a result, to get the help that we need. One resource that I really like to direct people to is a film called This Is Not About Me, which is a documentary that was put on by Assistiveware about Jordan Zimmerman, who is an autistic person and non-speaking, and it follows her experiences growing up in the public US school system as a non-speaking person who was not offered communication supports and who was often kind of pathologized as having just risky behavior without kind of thinking about or looking at that access to communication. There was very much this assumption that because Jordan was non-speaking, that she was incapable of learning, or that she was somehow incapable of trying to grasp onto or learn more or explore and take risks with information. And as a result of that, there was this ongoing cycle where Jordan's wants and dreams were kind of sidelined and frankly weren't heard in the first place because there was no attempt to communicate with her. And people didn't know until she got access to assistive communication when she was older that for her entire life she'd wanted to be a teacher. And that was something deeply heartbreaking to think about, particularly given that she was mistreated by the education system over and over and over again as a result of simply not being willing to try and understand her in the first place. So when thinking about risky behaviors, this is one thing I really want to hit home, is that you are talking to someone who has their own individual wants, needs, goals, and that being able to understand them is a critical part of kind of engaging with harm reduction around risky behaviors. And appropriately, a steering committee member here has a quote that talks about the fact that sensory needs need to be taken seriously and seen as an integral part of mental health care, because our culture doesn't make time for breaks and meeting bodily needs. So again, tying back into the idea of making sure that you're on the same page as your client. Oh, in the chat, someone asks how we can access the documentary, and Jules has provided a link to the film. Thank you so much. Next slide, please. It's also important to remember that we do have like shared human needs that are often underlying a lot of people's behaviors. So for example, when you think about why a lot of us might drink alcohol during a social event, that might be that you're a little bit anxious, maybe you're trying to take kind of the edge off your nerves to be able to talk with people. That's a thing that a lot of disabled people experience, a need for connection. So people might drink and might drink more than is strictly the safest in order to cope with overstimulation and social anxiety. They also might not steer into that direction, right? But like even just the touch of that risk might be coming from that need to try and put themselves in a place where they feel comfortable socializing. The need for connection, or frankly having a lack of social connection, can also kind of engage with other types of risky behavior. For example, self-harm and eating disorders can sometimes be founded in this need for connection and this fear and anxiety and loneliness. So when we think about this, it's important to recognize that disabled people are often held to a higher standard because everything we do is seen as kind of medicalized. So us, for example, having a drink at a bar is seen as very risky and very strange because a lot of the time we're not seen as an adult in an adult situation. Or disabled people having sex, or for example, engaging in like sexting with a partner might be seen as a risky behavior, when in practice, those are things that on average, like adults sometimes do with other adults. And while people might have different moral ideas about whether or not they approve of that, it's not inherently statistically by the numbers unusual, right, to do that with someone that you are engaged with. So one example that I will usually give around this is I have a friend who is a professor at a school in Chicago, and he is disabled and he teaches disability studies. And one of the classes he teaches is aimed at talking about like basics for people who are thinking about entering like a disability support professional realm of fields, right? It's also like kind of an intro to disability studies course. And one of the first things he sometimes has given in his class is an example where he'll kind of say, okay, so let me present you with this friend of mine. He's a 22-year-old dude. He is living with his parents. He doesn't eat the healthiest. His room is kind of a mess. And he spends a lot of time online playing Minecraft and playing online games with lots of people. And he doesn't have a job. He's not really interested in having a job. Are there like pieces of advice you might have for my friend? And instantly a lot of hands will go up and people will talk about vocational rehab. People will talk about getting access to support socially, access to social support groups, to friends, to like counseling, all the way, everything from like the lower or tier of that all the way up to institutionalization. And then after having taken all of these questions, he'll pause and he'll go, okay, so you've just offered me a lot of different ideas. So at what point did I tell you that this man was disabled? And everyone's face will just drop. Because the thing that they just did was what we do to a lot of disabled people. Because if you think of someone that you are mentally cataloging, right, as a not disabled 22-year-old dude who hasn't gone to college yet, or maybe is taking a gap year and is kind of in a messy room, that's seen as standard, right? That's what you kind of expect of a young adult who is just out of college, or maybe is about college transition age traditionally. But if a disabled person is doing that, suddenly it's very, very weird and pathologized and strange, despite being the same gender, the same age group, the same other social factors. So these are things where it's important to consider, like, would this be abnormal? Would this be quote unquote risky or something I'd feel the need to get outside help involved with if it were anyone else? And is there genuinely something that's making it more dangerous for them? And if so, to what extent is that something that needs outside help? Yep. And then one quote that came from me that I mentioned while we were kind of brainstorming around risky behaviors is that the pain you know is better than the pain you don't. And that is something that I come back to a lot when talking about harm reduction around risky behaviors, because if someone's trying to mask a hurt or a pain or prevent engagement with kind of something that they're afraid of, pain that you know, pain that you're familiar with, it sounds weird, but is more comfortable than a new, scary, unfamiliar pain that could be much worse and that you don't have a way to gauge if it's going to be worse. Next slide, please. So other risk factors here, resource silos. So having worked around the Link Center, folks know, but there are very few supports that really truly are designed to accommodate dual diagnosed people, folks who have additional mental health diagnoses. One example of this is an Oregon man who was denied mental health support because his clinicians thought that his symptoms were quote unquote behaviors. So for example, activity around self-harm, suicidality, or other risk factors that can sometimes be tied into mental health diagnoses can sometimes go under the rug because they're seen as people just air quotes, but only trying to get attention, only trying to do X, Y, or Z, rather than as an expression of pain, loss of control, loss of access to certain things. This is also an example of diagnostic overshadowing, which is saying that everything someone experiences is because of one diagnosis instead of recognizing that we can experience multiple problems at once. Next slide, please. So when thinking about this, how do we support people who are doing risky behaviors?
And I believe that is my turn.
Yes, it is.
Awesome. Thank you, Nor. So I think one of the biggest things for us to consider when we're talking about how to support people who are engaging in risky behaviors is changing the lens that we're thinking about this through. So right now, if you're someone who's doing a risky behavior, most of the quote unquote treatment or the intervention that you get uses a punitive lens, which basically means if you keep doing this behavior, you're going to be punished, you're going to have some privileges taken away, you're going to be treated like less of an adult, etc. We need to move from that towards what we call a restorative lens, which means let's figure out why you're doing this behavior so that we can stop or reduce harm, both the harm that could be coming from the behavior itself, but also the harm that the person doing the behavior could be facing that's causing them to do it in the first place. And when we think about using a restorative lens, we have to think about accountability. Holding someone accountable for something doesn't mean that we punish someone and give up on them. And conversely, it also doesn't mean that if somebody causes harm to another person, that we just let it slide under the rug because of a specific identity that they hold. It means that we help people understand natural consequences. So the things that happen as a direct result of what they're doing, and repair any harm that may be caused. So our steering committee members, when we talked about this concept of kind of trying to figure out root causes behind these behaviors, they had some really great things to say. One of our steering committee members, Perry, said that it's important to observe the context behind the behavior. Don't just assume the person is doing it on purpose. And I think sometimes, you know, when we're working with someone or we have a family member, however you're in relation to someone who is doing something that upsets you for a long time, it can be really easy to kind of become resentful and assume that like they're just doing it because they want attention or because they want to annoy you. And it's really important to kind of detach ourselves from that idea and think about the broader context and not just assume that they're doing it on purpose. And then Micah said, these behaviors don't just come from nowhere. We have to think about the unmet need. People need to have choices in their day. And this goes along with something we discussed with the steering committee members, which is that the more restrictive of a setting you're in, the less choices you're going to have in your day, right? So like if you're living in an institution, that's probably, you know, the most restrictive setting where you have the fewest choices in your day about when you get up, what you wear, what you eat, how you communicate, who you get to talk to, where you get to go. And as we, you know, kind of move away from institutions out in like the home and community-based services land, where I'm sure a lot of you do your work, those restrictions are still there in some ways. So it's important to think about where are people being denied the opportunity to make choices and how might that be contributing to the context behind whatever behavior they're doing. So an example of kind of thinking about the root cause of a behavior. Let's say that I am really mad, I need to release anger, and so I pick up this mug and I throw it across the room, right? Well, that's in conflict with my friend who's in the room with me, who needs to feel safe in the environment that she's in, and she doesn't feel safe if I'm throwing mugs at the wall. So how can we meet both needs? Well, maybe there's another way that I can learn how to release my anger that doesn't involve throwing something, Maybe there's something I can do to go off in, another place by myself, so I'm not in front of my friend scaring her, or releasing my anger in a less a less dramatic way, I guess. So kind of thinking about why is this happening in the first place, and what are maybe some alternatives that aren't going to cause as much harm. There is a really great quote from a really great, I'm not even sure what to call him. He is a social justice practitioner, who does a lot of amazing work around helping people who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated. He has an organization called the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, which is aimed at helping to make sure that people who have been to jail don't go back to jail. But he has this great metaphor that I'm going to read for you now called detangling hair. So he says, justice is like detangling hair. We start with our and each other's actions, then carefully follow them back to the human needs those actions are based in, just like we start with the ends of our hair and follow them back to the roots. Then we rearrange our actions in a way that respects everyone's needs. We can't get frustrated and cut someone's actions from the context of their needs, just like we can't just cut our hair off when detangling. It's the commitment to contextualizing people's actions in their needs that allows us to transform harm rather than cancel, commit war, and incarcerate each other. So basically what he's saying here is the thing we see, the tangled end of our hair, right, is whatever this risky behavior is. And we can't just cut off the hair at that part because we don't like what it looks like. We don't like what the person is doing. We have to figure out how to get our understanding from that tangled point back to the root, and do so in a way that respects the needs of everyone in the situation, which typically starts with the person who is engaging in the behavior. So a big part of making that happen is actually understanding people. Sometimes the assessments that we do, and I mean assessments in both the formal sense and the informal sense, like just assessing a situation that's in front of you. Sometimes we're just kind of listening for the boxes in our head that we already know to check. And that can result in misunderstandings, because if we're only listening to reply, or listening to what someone is saying or doing to check off those boxes we already have, there's a lot of information and context that we're going to miss. And this is why it's so important that people have multiple chances to try and make adjustments to new supports. Something that we see a lot, and a lot of this has to do with the way that insurance, for lack of a better term, screws people over when they're trying to access services. New supports often don't work on the first try, because you're not only trying to learn how to do the thing that you're getting the support to do, but you're learning how to use and engage with the support. So it's like a dual learning process that's a lot happening at the same time. So the more that we can let people try things again and make adjustments as needed, the better chance we have at getting to a place where we really understand the root problem, how that's impacting the behavior, and how we can best support someone to reduce harm all the way around. And it's important to note that culture and values play a really big role here, because what might be seen as risky in one culture, or to one person with a particular set of values, may not be risky in a different culture. I think an example that Nor gave when we were developing this is, in some cultures, like playfully teasing someone is seen as like a sign of affection and is like okay to do. In other cultures, playfully teasing someone is seen as really rude and you shouldn't do it. And so when we're guiding people and supporting people in like changing behaviors, we have to think about the context that they exist in, what their family life and their community looks like, and how those cultural norms play into what we're asking them to do or what they are wanting to do. And I basically just said all of this, really jumped the gun on this slide here. It's also important here to remember that not everyone from the same place or background is the same, right? So we don't want to like learn something about a culture and then say that like everyone in that culture thinks that way or acts that way. So while we're learning about the context or the culture that somebody is coming from, we also want to find out how much a person wants to stick to the norms of that culture. Just because someone was raised in, let's say, a like super conservative evangelical household doesn't mean that those are the cultural norms that they want to stick to as they, grow up and get their independence. And then it's really, really important here when we're kind of doing these assessments and learning about people to come from a place of curiosity rather than judgment. And this goes back to the kind of box checking thing that I was talking about earlier. If we go into a conversation with a kind of set desired outcome or a set way that we want things to go, rather than coming in with the goal of learning as much as we can from about the situation from the person who's experiencing it, it really not only limits what we can learn, it also makes it really hard to develop a relationship built on trust with that person, because if somebody feels like you're going to be judging them or shaming them or trying to change everything about who they are and what they're doing, they're going to be a lot less likely to trust you. And we're going to talk about why that trust piece is so important here in a second. Oh, come on, slides. Okay. So another element of this is creating safety. At our base, people need to feel safe in order to effectively receive support. And this can't happen if we're constantly shaming them or threatening them, or telling them they're going to be in trouble. So when you say, stop doing this behavior or you're going to face XYZ consequence, what a person who is feeling shamed might hear is, oh, well, if I do this behavior, then I can't tell you about it, so I need to hide it. And that is something that is so common, especially when people are engaging in behaviors that are heavily stigmatized, like self-harm, for example. We feel the shame. We know we're not supposed to be doing it. We know that somebody's going to be upset with us, and so we hide it. And that actually makes it a lot harder to get support and recover. So the less shame we have as we're having these discussions with people and talking to them about the behaviors that they're engaging in, the more likely it is that they'll feel safe to tell us what's really going on and what they really need. Something that I have learned from a number of friends and colleagues I have who work in harm reduction and like various treatment settings is that people who are struggling with risky behaviors or just struggling, in general, are dealing with fear. And what that fear is of, what they're afraid of, varies from person to person. But when someone is in crisis and they're really scared, the cure, quote unquote, for fear is not punishment, right? Because that just leads to that shame spiral that we were talking about. The quote unquote cure, or at least a good place to start, is connection. Because again, the more we feel like we have people we can go to and people that we can authentically connect with to get the support that we need, the more likely it is that we're going to be amenable to receiving that support. A metaphor for this that I like to use is that dough can't rise in a cold room. So like if you're making bread or something, usually you have to like let the dough sit in a warm place so that the right chemical reactions happen, so it rises and then it'll be ready to bake. Just like dough won't rise in a cold room, people can't reduce harm in a hostile environment. So we have to create a space where people feel safe to heal before we can expect them to work towards that healing. Oh, come on, slides. Something else that I wanted to touch on here is a lot of what we've been talking about and what we will continue to talk about is what happens before and during a crisis, or before and during when someone is engaging in a risky behavior, but we often don't talk about what happens afterwards. And this is something that one of our steering committee members, Micah, brought up that I thought was so insightful, which is we need people to check in with us after meltdowns instead of just leaving us on our own. I think we worry so much about preventing or dealing with a crisis that we forget about what does aftercare look like? How do we, continue to engage with someone after they've maybe done something that they regret or done something that has caused harm to themselves or to someone else? The way that we support people in that aftermath is just as important as those other things, because for the most part, these are not just things that are happening, one and done. It's a pattern of behavior or a pattern of challenges that someone is facing. And the aftercare is a part of that. And some of the resources that we'll share have more information on exactly what that can look like. I wish we had a jillion hours, but we have 90 minutes. So one of the most valuable tools that we have in supporting people who are engaging in risky behaviors is harm reduction. And this is the concept of harm reduction isn't new. It's been in practice in a lot of different spaces, particularly in like the substance use space for decades. But as in terms of how it applies to behavioral supports and things like that, we still see a lot of clinicians, direct support professionals, family members, really everyone thinking about how do we get someone to stop doing a behavior completely? How do we get them to abstain from the behavior? When what might be a better question to ask, at least to start, is how do we make sure that if they're doing that behavior or they have a need that needs to be met, that they can do that in a safe way? And there's a few different principles of harm reduction that I think really kind of apply to these types of situations. One is tapering. We'll give a more concrete example here in a minute, but basically tapering means that we try to reduce the amount or the intensity that someone is doing a harmful behavior a little bit at a time. And we'll have an example of that in a second. But the reason why harm reduction is so effective is that it takes the shame and the stigma out of the behavior, because we're not saying the behavior you're doing is bad and you need to stop doing it 100% right now. We say, hey, I see that you're struggling with this behavior. What's going on? Why are you doing it? And what can we do to support you so that you can either do it more safely or find another way to meet the need that that behavior is meeting? So it is a great method to use to build trust. So an example of this, and this content warning here for self-harm, but an example of this is cutting. So let's say you have someone who is frequently cutting their own skin. So some tangible tools that we can use to reduce harm would be things like making sure they have sterile blades, because if they're using dirty blades, they're more likely to get an infection of some kind. Making sure they have an easily accessible first aid kit so that if they maybe cut deeper than they intended to, they have a way to dress those wounds in a way that can reduce the amount of excessive bleeding. And wound care training, how to avoid major arteries, things like that. So basically saying, hey, if you're gonna cut your skin, the way to do it is in a way that's not gonna make you bleed out. And here we have an example of tapering here. So we start with setting small goals to reduce cutting. So let's say if the person is cutting their whole forearm, right? Trying to keep new cuts in a smaller area for the next week. Or if someone is cutting every day, setting a goal to have one cut-free day, one day where you don't cut yourself in the next week, small steps. And a lot of people, when they hear us talking about harm reduction in this context, are like, that's wild. Why are you endorsing people cutting themselves? And this goes back to the shame piece, right? Because we're not saying you should cut yourself. We're saying, hey, you're cutting yourself. While we work on getting you to stop cutting yourself, we know that's not going to happen overnight, because the reason you're doing it is not going to be resolved overnight. So while we work on that, we're going to make sure that you don't severely injure yourself while you're engaging in this behavior. So as a reminder, harm reduction strategies are not going to work if you keep the person who needs support in a stressful care environment. So that's that dough can't rise in a cold room metaphor, right? We have to kind of do two things at once here. We use those harm reduction strategies and we work on that detangling hair bit. So the harm reduction strategies deal more up front with the behavior, and the detangling hair piece helps us get to kind of the root cause. We can't work on the behavior in a productive way without learning how to meet the unmet need that is causing it. A few other great quotes from our steering committee here. Emily said, self-harm can feel like a way to take control. So that's like a super clear indication of using self-harm as a way to meet an unmet need. Danielle said, self-injury for stimming versus for self-punishment are different things. Taking it out on yourself instead of someone else because you'll get in less trouble. So sometimes, you have this pent-up anger, frustration, or you're experiencing sensory overwhelm and you don't know what to do, and you want to lash out, but you know that if you hit the person next to you, you're going to be in huge trouble. And depending on the setting you're in, that trouble can range from being yelled at to going to jail. so you take it out on yourself instead, because you know that you won't face the same level of consequences. So again, this all comes back to, why is this happening in the first place, and how do we address that? So while we talk about risk factors and the things that make it more likely for someone to engage in risky behaviors, we also want to talk about protective factors, which is the opposite of risk factors. Protective factors are parts of a person's life that can help them be safe and happy. So some examples are positive relationships with caregivers, family, friends, and providers. Basics like having your basic needs met, having, enough food during the day, being housed, having access to basic health care. All of these things are protective factors. And to build positive relationships, to create those as a protective factor in someone's life, we have to build trust. And that takes us all the way kind of back around to the beginning, right? Where if there's shame, we can't build trust. And if there's no trust, we can't really cultivate healing. Summed up really nicely by our steering committee member, Micah, who said, we need to use strength-based interventions. Protective factors can help us keep people in a better state of mind. And so focusing not only on, hey, what's going wrong in your life, but hey, what's going right in your life? And how can we increase the amount of things that are going right in your life can be really helpful for folks. Nor, is this you?
Yep.
All right, back to Nor.
Woo. And kind of adding on to that, so on the note of what's going right in your life, having control over your life is a decent part of that, yeah? So another piece to talk about here is autonomy, and basically having access to control over some choices about your life. So when we're thinking about support services, it's important to recognize that a lot of people with IDD or with mental health disabilities will have had choices taken away from them for a long time, and that this is a type of trauma, and that trauma-informed care for people with this experience means empowering them by giving them choices. So while thinking about this, for example, if, say, someone is transitioning into having home and community-based services after being in a more restrictive environment for a long time, going back to what Jules was talking about in terms of having had less decisions available to them around what people they make friends with, what type of clothing they can wear, what type of activities they can do during the day, when you get up, when you go to bed, and how that may have changed, or frankly, in some cases, how it may have not when they've changed environments can make a huge difference in terms of feeling like you have gained control over your life or feeling like you have access to more choices. And that's going to directly correlate to whether people are going to try and seek more control through possibly some of those more risky activities. So again, if you feel like you have that lack of connection because you haven't had the ability to choose who your friends are for a long time, you might take out that loneliness in some other outlet, right? So autonomy is directly tied to effectively all of this in terms of how much control we feel like we have. Next slide, please.
Sorry, 1 second.
You're good.
There we go.
Yay. All right, so some examples we have around autonomy from our steering committee members. Alicia mentions we need to find ways to stop repeatedly traumatizing people by making them relive their trauma every time they go to get services. Kim mentions that PTSD can trigger meltdowns and vice versa. So meltdowns can trigger folks' PTSD as well. We need to pay attention to the relationship between these things, and also to note that sometimes we just need space. Don't keep poking the bear. So if aftercare for an individual person looks like, for example, being left alone for a while, that's a valid decision that people can get to make. Monica mentions the system is not transparent with people receiving treatment, and that doing that, so being transparent with people receiving treatment, means we have to treat adults like adults and make them aware of consequences. Micah mentions meltdowns are part of life. Non-disabled people have bad days too. My emotions can be big sometimes, so we need to co-create plans to deal with meltdowns rather than trying to get them to go away entirely. And feeding into that, next slide, we have tools for providing choices. So the basics here are things like access to communication methods and devices of our choice, accessible information, so knowing the whole situation, freedom to mask and unmask and stim without judgment. So collaborative planning tools. So basically what this is planning in advance for what to do if you have a crisis and planning for what kind of care you want to receive in that situation. Some resources we have here, and a bunch of these are also on the Link Center's resources page, are Tips to Manage Triggers, which was made by Max Barrows and Perry. We have What to Do When I Don't Feel Okay, which is a worksheet from Ren and Cololoni at Communication First. We also have the supported decision-making page from ASAN and pod mapping from Mia Mingus, along with the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collaborative. Basically, these are all different ways of visualizing what leads up to folks being in crisis, as well as what decisions people want made when they happen. So, for example, what type of aftercare they might want to receive, what people they may or may not want contacted, and at what point they might want specific services involved. Next slide, please. All right, and we are going to turn this back over to the Link Center for a group exercise.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jules and Noor. What a great perspective on supporting people. And hopefully, Jules and Noor have given you all a lot to think about. So this is where, and I'll invite my colleague Jean Farr up. We will be walking you through the group exercise that I mentioned earlier. We're going to present a scenario that talks about navigating risky behaviors. And what we really hope now is to hear from you all about how you think of this topic through the discussion around this scenario. And we just want to put it out there that there are no wrong answers and ideas, because we believe that you're the experts of your own experience, and we just want to hear from you. This is the shared part of the shared learning group. So the Link Center just wants to know what you were thinking so we can elevate things you bring up that we may not have thought about. And we know that there's a lot out there that we may not have thought about. And we also want to hear from you because you may be sharing things that we can take action on, whatever that looks like in the space of the Link Center. So you can raise your hand to come off mute. You can even come on camera if you want. You can write your thoughts in the chat, or you can email us later. We'll put our email in the chat for you. But we do want to hear from you, and we're giving you different ways to let us hear your thoughts. Okay. So here's the scenario and the prompt. I'll go ahead and read this out loud. You have an adult client who has regularly ended up with welts on her arms from repeatedly slapping them. You feel worried. What are some questions you can ask to better understand the situation? And again, really like thinking about what Jules and Noor shared with us, putting that into practice, and just some things that come to mind for you all in the work that you do.
And hi, everybody. This is Jean, and I am co-leading this part of our time together. I am an older woman with short brown hair, glasses, a brown sweater, and scarf. And I'm going to be looking at the chat and sharing any kind of thoughts that that you'd all like to share with us. And as Stacy said, we're really excited to hear what your perspectives are and what you can offer here.
I see Jessica said in the chat, a good question to ask would be, how are you feeling? And maybe showing a visual. I really like this answer because one, it's a direct question. We're not beating around the bush. And so that's nice. And also showing a visual tells us that we're open to maybe different ways of accessible communication that person might need. So sometimes for a lot of us, it can be hard to just conjure the words off the bat to describe how we're feeling. So maybe a feelings chart, or if you've ever seen like the feelings wheel that starts with like basic emotions and then branches out into more like nuanced feelings. I think all of those are really great tools to use.
I'm also seeing here that Mary said, share with them that you're worried and ask them if they would like to talk to you about anything. So just kind of extending yourself and inviting them to share their feelings. Kylie mentioned that ask if the slapping of the arms is at a certain time. Is it during transition times? Kind of, it's another thing to think about. Someone else, Alicia said to all of us, one could, you could say, oh no, what happened to your arms? Are you okay? What can I do to help? Amber suggested that we think about what is the antecedent, what happened directly before the behavior, what triggers it from both the kind of direct and indirect influences to think about that. Again, asking the person how they're feeling, if there is anything that can be done to help. Also, Kelly said that a way to follow up would be to say, it looks like you might be frustrated. How can I help? I'm here to listen if you'd like to talk. Kelly Forrest says, asking ourselves what's happening around the person when these events occur. Sort of what might the environmental triggers be? And what Melissa says, what is her mood before, during, and after the slapping? Randy said, ask if the person would be okay hitting a pillow or something different, and ask what's provoking the behavior to see if they know and can communicate. So those are some of the responses.
I'm really loving and Jules and Nora, I think people are hearing your message that involving the person is really important to understanding or looking at things through the restorative lens, understanding the why. So I'm really, really heartened to see you all thinking about ways to engage the person around what's happening, how can I be helpful, and just really also emphasizing, Jules, what you brought up just a moment ago and what was really discussed earlier around risk factors is also really at the forefront, be thinking about communication. And I just want to make a point and just emphasize the point that when someone is struggling and when someone may be challenged by a situation, they may not be at their communicative best, right? Myself included. And so I think we need to take that into account, that although someone may communicate in one way when they're, quote, feeling okay, they may need to communicate in a different way when they're not feeling okay.
Yeah, thanks for that, Stacy. I think it's also really important. I'm seeing a lot of responses in the chat where we're thinking about this from a how do I put this? Like an observational perspective, where we're looking at the person and thinking about, oh, we're going to track these behaviors, we're going to put them on a chart, and we're going to collect all the data, right? And I think it's really important to remember that the most important part of all of this is allowing the person to have agency in how the behavior is being addressed. And so while there might be some stuff that like I guess what I'm saying is, if you go into the situation and you're like, these are what these context clues mean to me, and this is what I think, and this is how I'm assessing it based on what I know, that's a lot of I, right? And so going into it with, okay, here's what I'm seeing. What are the possible things this could mean? Let me talk to this person or communicate with them however they communicate, and see if what I'm thinking is on par with what they're experiencing. Something that we see often is that people who are doing risky behaviors are treated like they don't understand why they're doing the behavior, or they're treated like they are helpless, and like that they have no control over the behavior. And that's the type of thinking that we want to avoid. So we always want to engage with people from a perspective where we're presuming competence, where we're assuming that they absolutely have the ability and probably the desire to figure out what's going on and figure out a better alternative. Nora, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that covers a lot of it. I think what I would add is that a lot of the responses I'm seeing have like really good like emotional attempting to address this from like, I care about you and I want to make sure that I want to make sure that I can support you as best I can. I think kind of building off what we were talking about earlier about communication, recognizing that if people's answer in the immediate moment is no, that's okay. It's okay to reapproach the situation later on when they're feeling more stable or at a point where they feel more like set to talk about those things. And by that same standard, like we should always presume competence, and also if people might understand but have difficulty communicating the root of the feeling because maybe there's a whole bunch of it, maybe it's a whole bunch of different triggers, scenarios, traumas building up all at once. I think someone in the chat mentioned journaling, like offering them additional tools that are not solely talking directly to you can also be a really valuable addition. Things like journaling, charting, writing stuff out, or even like recording voice notes on their phone, for example, all totally valid ways to approach this. Just kind of giving people options. You don't necessarily need to like start from like, here is every single possible way you could talk to me about this, but like letting them know that if it doesn't feel comfortable to talk to me directly, is there another way you'd like to go about this, like journaling, writing, doing art, making voice notes, what have you, is also totally a valid way to approach this.
And I
Thank
think
you.
what we're hearing also is just, affirming, providing a safe space, and options so that, they aren't being sort of bombarded by attempts to help, when allowing them to just be where they're at and working with them to support however they want to communicate where they're at and what's going on in their own time.
Yeah, and one more thing that I want to just kind of drive home is I think sometimes people, especially when they're working with non-speaking folks or folks who don't currently have a robust system of communication in place, they can interpret that as that means the person doesn't have these feelings because they don't communicate them in the way that I understand them. And therefore we kind of go back to that old habit of interpreting what we see through the lens of our understanding rather than through the lens of that person's understanding. So that's why communication supports are so, so crucial in all of this. Because just because someone doesn't have a robust communication system right now doesn't mean they never will. And B, in the interim, while we're figuring that out with someone, which is a fundamental right that everyone should have access to, though they don't in a lot of places, we want to make sure that we're centering that person's feelings rather than our comfort with what they're doing.
Yes, Joel, and I think not to continue to harp on the piece around communication, but I'm going to. I think that in the content that you all presented, particular to protective factors, that communication is such an important piece of preventative and protective factors for people. And when people are feeling good, that is a place for us as supporters to really be diving in, even for people who are non-speaking. What are the ways that they can communicate, on a day-to-day basis, and then in times when they're not feeling good or okay, right? So I just want to add that. I know that, Jules, when you spoke about protective factors, the piece was really around relationships, which I think is so important, and trust and rapport, especially with people who are supporting you and people who, you may be relying on. But I think communication is another piece to really be thinking about. And I know that we're coming up on time, but we did have like sort of a part 2 to this that I want to throw out there and see if there's some reactions. Sorry, I think there's a few of us hitting the slide. So here we go. Okay, so thinking about the same person, you talk to this person and she indicates that she's slapping her arms because she likes the feeling and it helps her stay focused on whatever she is doing at the moment. So our question to you now, given what we talked about earlier around harm reduction, which may be a very new thought for you all in terms of support, but what are some options for harm reduction you might be able to do based on that information? So again, feel free to put your thoughts in the chat. Always happy to have you come off mute if you feel so inclined.
So Michael said, oh, this might have been, and never mind, this was related to the last question.
Yeah, I think this is an area where we get to do some really kind of outside of the box thinking with people.
Yeah.
And I see people are saying things like suggest alternatives that allow the same stimulation, like the rubber band method, a soft hair tie to snap instead. So like I used to really have an issue with pinching my skin really hard until I would get bruises. And now I have this fidget that I use that I can pinch and pull apart that gives me a similar sensation. So I have another place to get that urge out without hurting myself. And so sometimes there are those like pretty simple one-to-one alternatives that you can help people with. Sometimes it takes a little bit more like trial and error. But I think just thinking about like, okay, what are some things that could provide a similar sensory sensation, and like, let's try a couple of those and see if any of that would work.
Yeah, great. And Jules, such a good point about the trial and error piece, right? If one thing doesn't work, we don't stop there and say that doesn't work. This replacement or harm reduction isn't working for this person, right? So that's good point. And I'm seeing a lot of really great examples in the chat of some things to try, part of the menu.
Right.
Also, I just want to say Betsy had a really interesting answer. As long as she isn't doing any serious harm, tell her it's fine. Yeah, like this is a situation where like we might look at someone like smacking themselves on the arm and be like, oh God, that's so weird, stop. But if we like really think about it, like, okay, if you aren't actually hurting yourself and you're not hurting anyone else, and you just like the way it feels and it helps you, maybe it's okay to just use that as a coping tool. And if you have the desire to transition to something else, we can work with you on that. But maybe the person is kind of just good where they're at, and that's okay to consider too. Again, it's about coming at it from the lens of their understanding and context for existence and not your own.
I mean, isn't that the crux of the whole, all of our time together, really? It's not imposing our own thought, our own sort of opinions or perspectives, but again, honoring the person where they're at and doing everything we can to learn and respectfully be there with them. So as we move toward sort of closing our time together today, what a rich time it's been. It's just been so amazing. Please continue to think about just what has changed, how you think about the words risky behaviors. Think about this, and we'd love it if you would share it with us over time. Maybe drop us an email. I think that I'm pretty sure most of us, if not all of us, have learned how to look at that term differently and more expansively. So thank you all for that. And share with us, please, what are your go-to resources, trainings, websites? What are things that you can share with us that would help us better communicate just the many important perspectives around navigating risky behaviors. You can put them in the chat now, or again, after you've had time to think about it, just email it to all of us. And we wanted to make sure that you had in mind the schedule for the shared learning groups. As you know, we are currently in the middle of our 5th one, the first one of this second year together. And so look at these. We look forward to, of course, the rest of this day and tomorrow, but then in January, moving through the justice system. So we've got a lot of great shared learning groups coming up, and look forward to all of your engagement. Now, you can always visit the Link Center's website anytime. Here's a QR code, here's the address, and you'll be able to look at transcripts from this, or recordings from this, pardon me, in the future. And we're, you always have that as a resource. And we are so committed to learning from you and improving the future of our sessions and pretty much everything we do. So please take a moment to click on this QR code, or we will also place a direct link in the chat box. But we're very, very committed to learning from all of you, and your feedback is critically important for us. So we will also email you, just so you know, after this, a link in case you don't have time to do it right now. Before we conclude our time, thank you so much, Jules and Noor. Thank you so much. Thank you for leading us, and for Stacy, all the steering committees who have been a part of this, all of our partners, of course, at the Link Center, all of you behind the scenes who have done everything that you can to help this be such a rich session. And as always, we thank the ACL and again, everyone. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And again, we're so grateful to all of you. and look forward to next time that we're together. Thank you.